remember the teacher talked and we listened. We had to memorise quite a lot too. A lot of time was spent giving out books and collecting them up again. We were sitting in rows in desks so we could see the board better because talk and chalk was the way.
Education has been evolving and has taken different forms. In the past decade or two, teaching has changed significantly. So much in fact that schools may not be what some of us remember from our own childhood. Changes have affected both the opportunities and the challenges of teaching, as well as the attitudes, knowledge, and skills needed to prepare for a teaching career. There are many educators who contributed and have witnessed this evolution. CoLabTalks is an initiative that captures this journey from the perspective of educators who have seen the education ecosystem evolving. It's all about the philosophy and story of these educators. We at CoLab present to you CoLabTalks, and we take immense pleasure in welcoming you all to the second episode of CoLabTalks with Art Markman, who is a cognitive scientist and has published over 150 scholarly works and has authored 5 books.
All of us have a mind, and all of us are asked to use that mind on a daily basis. And yet almost none of us are taught the way that the mind works. So one of the things that I think is fascinating about psychology is that not only is it just an amazing science to study, but it's something that really can benefit the people who learn about it.
Broadly speaking, if we think about higher education, we're really talking about the lifelong learning that starts with students who finished high school, the traditional bachelor's programs that meet from the ages of 18 to 22 roughly, followed by potential graduate education that could take place immediately afterwards or may be delayed, particularly in the case of programs like MBA programs. As well as the lifelong learning that we're expecting people to go through now in the context of careers that are going to shift rapidly every several years. And so those continuing education programs can be degree programs. Here at the University of Texas, we have a number of programs that are aimed at mid-career professionals to give them master's degrees. But in addition to that, you see lots of certificate programs and even one-day courses that people can take to pick up new skills and information and knowledge that they can use in their jobs immediately. And all of that, I think, is fundamentally the mission of the modern university. We are here to support not just traditional undergraduates, not just the kinds of research students who may go on to become faculty, but also broadly speaking, workforce development. Myself, my career, I started out as a professor of psychology, doing research and teaching classes to undergraduates and traditional graduate students, largely PhD students. Over the years, I've shifted my role somewhat. I helped to found a program at the University of Texas called the Human Dimensions of Organizations that brings the liberal arts, the humanities, social and behavioral sciences to people in organizational contexts. And in addition to that, provides not just a master's degree, but also continuing and professional ed. And actually, we ultimately created an undergraduate degree because of the success of these skills in the older students that we were teaching. That experience then led to the position that I'm in currently, which is coordinating these kinds of professional development activities across the university, across all of the colleges and schools that we have. I think that the biggest evolution that I've seen in education in the traditional higher education sector, meaning colleges and universities, is the increasing focus in learners who are beyond the traditional age of students going to college. Now, there have always been a certain number of programs aimed at getting bachelor's degrees to students who may not have been ready for college when they were younger. And obviously there's always also been community colleges that have served some of these functions, particularly for older learners. But I think that over the last 15 years, there's really been a concerted effort by a variety of colleges and universities to also engage people more fully throughout their lifespan and to create a real relationship with learners with the expectation that they're going to continue to come back every year, every 2 years to pick up new skills, to learn the latest knowledge in their fields, and also to help themselves to transition to new opportunities, because there's just less of an expectation that people are going to take a particular job along a specific career path following their bachelor's degree and then stay in that career path for the lifespan. And so universities have really been forced to adapt to that circumstance. And the most prominent universities are the ones who tend to be most successful in that space. So I think if you look at the colleges and schools that have the biggest programs in continuing and professional education, they tend to be the ones with the largest external reputation. So on the private side, that includes Harvard and MIT and Stanford in the US. And on the public side, that includes Berkeley and Michigan and the University of Texas as public universities. I think that this rethinking of the nature of how education works has required a lot of additional partnerships that weren't necessarily part of the way that we planned education in more traditional settings. There's been a lot more engagement with industry, partnerships in which we either have advisory boards or we bring together industry groups to help to understand what kinds of education are needed at the moment to provide the right kind of workforce development. There's a lot more custom programming going on in which organizations are coming to universities and really trying to craft closer partnerships in which they get precisely the kind of education they need by picking out the faculty that they'd like to work with, and then working with those faculty to develop programs that will meet specific needs of those organizations, both training their specific employees as well as providing training that might provide a pipeline for future hiring. So in fast-growing towns, which you see all over the world, but Austin, Texas, where I live, is a great example of that, where the population of the city has doubled over the last 20 years. You've seen a lot of companies who are really seeking a new pipeline of employees and looking to the universities to be partners in that process in training people to have the skills that they're going to need in order to hire them. And so I think that this really requires a very different mindset. It requires having the deans who run the colleges to really be thinking in a more entrepreneurial way about the kinds of programs that they might create. It requires getting faculty to think about the ways that their expertise might be used beyond the particular research that they do. In what ways can the knowledge and skills that they have be transferred to people who may not be becoming researchers, but instead might be using that knowledge in their day-to-day lives to enhance the work that they're doing. And so those kinds of partnerships have required a real mindset shift. In some ways, that's required creating additional incentives, largely in the form of additional recognition and sometimes additional pay for the people who engage in those activities, as well as highlighting those activities to make sure that everyone at the university is aware that those are valued. Because this is a real shift from the expectations when many of our faculty were hired. Certainly when I got my first faculty position in 1993, the expectation was that you would teach your traditional classes to undergraduates and graduate students and do your research, get research grants, and become known through the research you were doing. There was really no expectation that this kind of lifelong education was going to be part of the job. That's been a much more recent development, and one that I think universities have had to create some incentive for people to engage in. I think that as we think about how to transform, it's very important that we have data that allow us to make this transformation. Some of that data is projective data about the skills that are needed. So instead of simply teaching things that are based on what our beliefs about the importance of a particular discipline. So if you look at the development of a curriculum, say for a psychology program, like the ones that I had taught in for many years, the expectation was that we as experts had a pretty good idea of what was required to make someone a qualified psychologist, whether it was a research psychologist or a clinical psychologist, and then we based our curriculum on our understanding of those best practices. I think the shift now is that we're, particularly as we think about continuing and professional education, is making use of workforce data, whether it comes from government sources or from private sources that collect that data, to really begin to understand what the market is going to look like in future years so that we can craft education experiences that will help people to meet those needs in the workforce moving forward. So we need data from that standpoint, but we also need better data to know how effective our education is. So one of the things that we focused on, we have an academic affairs unit here at the university, and we spend a lot of time worrying about how can we be very clear about what the desired learning outcomes are for the people who engage with us, to provide assessments that will help us to know whether people have achieved the learning outcomes that we desire, and to the extent that they have, to help that to engage with jobs and with other potential employers. And to the extent that we have not reached our goals in a particular course, in what ways can we revamp that and create a very iterative design process in which we can continuously improve the quality of what we're doing. And this has become more complicated in some ways by the fact that, particularly accelerated by the pandemic, more and more of our education is being delivered online, and to some degree not just online but also asynchronously, meaning that not everyone is taking the course at the same time. And so we're providing materials and we're providing exercises, but students are engaging with those in a more self-paced way. And so getting the right kind of feedback from our learners, getting the right kind of feedback about their performance is complicated when we aren't teaching a traditional class in which everyone is in the same place at the same time and doing the same assessments at the same time. And so we've had to adapt the tools that we're using, making more use of the kinds of data that come out of learning management systems, and then finding ways to analyze that data in order to understand the determinants of student success. So this has been a much more difficult enterprise, but one that's extraordinarily important if we're going to meet the needs of the employers, but also in recognition of the fact that the higher education space, and particularly the continuing and professional education space, is a much more competitive landscape than it was in the past. So years ago, colleges and universities were the dominant players, with obviously other institutions like community colleges also playing a role. But there weren't as many for-profit companies who were engaged in these activities. These for-profit companies often provide a very high-quality experience that is specifically tailored to the needs of certain kinds of learners. And so they're providing very stiff competition to the traditional universities. And as a result, colleges and universities have had to up their game and really be prepared to make use of the latest learning processes and to do a much better job of continuous improvement of the education that we provide. And so I think that competition has been a benefit to us in many ways, forcing us to take new approaches to the way that we think about education. I think that as we think globally, one of the things that we need to do is to continue to reach out and to provide our education, not just, here we are an education institution in the United States. We need to be providing our education around the world. We need to be engaging, but not just reaching out. We need to also really understand the job markets globally. Not just global companies, but also what do people in other countries, what are they looking for, and how can we help to provide that? How can we provide the kinds of industry recognized certifications that may be valuable to people across the world? and to really recognize that we live in a global talent market and that companies are not simply hiring in their local area, and again, accelerated by the pandemic, are much more willing to have people who are working remotely as long as they have the right skills to do the job. And so I think that this is a fascinating time for people to be in education, and particularly in higher education, because I think there are a lot more opportunities now to engage around the globe, to really engage with learners from a variety of age spans. One of the things that I've personally found very rewarding about the teaching that I do of our mid-career professionals in programs like the Human Dimensions of Organizations is that I'm talking to people who have a wealth of experience and knowledge from their careers that they're bringing into the classroom, and they ask better questions, they are more demanding of the knowledge that they get, and they really force you to think about your own domain of expertise from a very different perspective. So this is, I think, just a wonderful time to be involved in this kind of education. And personally, I look forward to creating more global partnerships so that we can also take into account the variety of important cultural differences that may spell success or failure for our learners as they go into the workplace, to understand how to navigate the particular cultures in which they're living, and then to be able to bring knowledge and skills to their organizations in a way that will allow them to be heard.